So you are the world expert on LBJ. There is absolutely no doubt. I happen to be a gigantic LBJ fan, but you know more about him really than any human alive. And I wonder why you think his legacy is so critically relevant and important today.
Let me ask you guys, who knows LBJ? This is not a quiz, I promise. You talked about quizzes earlier. This is not a quiz. But who knows Lyndon Johnson? Raise your hand high if you could. Okay, right. Everyone knows. What do you think of when you think of Lyndon Johnson? And any answer is fair. Shout them out.
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Good for you. Vietnam.
Master politician.
Master politician, a paragon of power. Right. What else?
Right.
Civil rights. What else do you think about? Lady Bird Johnson, his wife. One or two more.
JFK.
JFK. The successor to JFK. What else? Texas. Wow, good answer. Really good answer. And it's a pretty broad spectrum of why LBJ is important. You heard the bad things. You heard Vietnam, which was a quagmire. And Lyndon Johnson did not start the war in Vietnam, but he certainly escalated the war. And it ended up being a quagmire. And it had a marked effect on our view of government as a consequence of the mismanagement of that war. But then there's the domestic policy, including civil rights, right? Civil rights is the one area that had held us back. The issue of race is the great paradox of the American experience, right? It held us back for many years, and our most basic tenet, the most basic egalitarian promise that we have as a nation, that all men, I would say all men and women now, are created equal, was violated by the policies that we had in place, right? It's Lyndon Johnson that allows us to realize that most basic premise, that all men are created equal, with the fruition of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act and the Fair Housing Act. But in addition to that, you have, I think, what is the platform for modern America. You have federal aid to education, you have Medicare, you have Medicaid, you have public broadcasting, you have environmental protection, and probably a few things that I've forgotten. You have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And who goes to school on a Pell Grant? Who went to school? Yeah, Pell Grant? So did I. I would not have gone to school but for the profusion of federal aid that LBJ put into education, had an effect on my life directly. So again, I think you see through the Great Society, including civil rights, that LBJ creates this platform that allows us to enter into a new age in America. And he was not given credit for that. He was given credit or discredited for Vietnam. He was given credit for being a master politician, a paragon of power, somebody who innately understood how power works, and was probably the most powerful and youngest majority leader in the history of our country. You can see through LBJ how power works, and that in itself is fascinating. You got to study the Vietnam War, the downside of that legacy, but you also have to appreciate what he does through the power of the presidency to bring America into a new, more fair, more just, more decent age.
So there's a quiz here. You mentioned about 5 acts. There were 84, right? 84 of them. You want to give us the other 79? No, just kidding. Just kidding. So there's a lot of attention right now to voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. A lot of talk about gerrymandering possibilities in some states, and not to be partisan really at all, but what is your view of the future of the Voting Rights Act and a lot of these acts that are under attack right now? Do you think we can protect them? Do you think we'll have a legitimate election in 26?
Do I have to say this into the microphone? Look, I mentioned that litany of legislation that is so seminal to American life that LBJ put into place through this great vision he had. By the way, he was finishing essentially the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt never touched race. Couldn't touch race because the Southern Democrats who controlled Congress were the ones who were helping him to enact his legislative agenda. And he couldn't violate their trust or risk their support by supporting civil rights. LBJ put his own political career at risk in order to do so. He famously said, "What the hell's the presidency for?" When someone said, "Put civil rights aside until you get elected to the presidency in your own right." He refused to do that. He saw he had an opportunity to put the Civil Rights Acts on the books, and he didn't hesitate. But his proudest legislative accomplishment, and this speaks volumes if you know his legislative record, was the Voting Rights Act. Because he believed that if everyone had unfettered access to the ballot box, we would have a truly representative democracy. So there would be no need for civil rights, right? Your representative would understand what you needed. And I think he was in large part right. Bear in mind, though, that act has been eviscerated. It was gutted in a Supreme Court decision in 2014 or 2015, I believe. And it's been further gutted since. His proudest legislative achievement. And I mentioned that array of laws. Let me just enumerate for 1 second, if I may. It's in 65 alone. I did this for you last night, Elizabeth. In 65 alone, which is the high tide of the Great Society, this legislative suite of programs that LBJ enacted. You have the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, VISTA, Job Corps, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts. You have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Highway Beautification Act, the Higher Education Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Immigration Act, the most sweeping immigration reform in the history of our country, and the Voting Rights Act. 1 year of the Johnson presidency. But in addition to that, you also have the creation of public broadcasting, NPR and PBS. You have the Freedom of Information Act. I mentioned before, you have the Civil Rights Act. You have the Wilderness Act. You have all this other legislation too. And that's exactly what's being torn down right now. You have the Kennedy Center. It wasn't the creation of John F. Kennedy. It was named for Kennedy. It was created by LBJ. It was never in JFK's plans. So these things, big and small, that's what's being eradicated today. You hear about the policies of Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, for that matter, being torn down by the current administration, but mostly it's the laws of the Great Society. And we don't know what the downstream effects of that eradication, that systematic eradication of government is going to be. That's going to fall on you guys. And I'm so glad that you're not only in this program, but that you're optimistic about the future, because it's you who are going to have to rebuild government. And not only rebuild government, but rebuild trust in government, which was at an all-time high when LBJ took the presidency.
No pressure, all of you. Yeah. All on you. That's a great answer. So these books that Mark has written, you got to read them all. They are fabulous. And the most recent, Make Your Mark, Lessons in Character from 7 Presidents. In that, you go through, I think, presidents you've interviewed. Is it? Yeah, 7 of them.
Not Joe Biden. He was.
Right. And you define character for each one in a couple of words. So I wonder, this is going to be a long answer, but it's so interesting that you know these people. We do not know them. First of all, how did you find that? Or what are the few words for each one? And can you tell us a little anecdote about them through that interview? Stuff you can tell us publicly?
Of course, I'd be happy to. Elizabeth, the book is called Make Your Mark, Lessons in Character for 7 Presidents. And there was a woman named Claire Booth Luce, who was a congressman, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, but also a congresswoman from Connecticut. And she used to famously lecture the presidents that she knew, from Herbert Hoover through Ronald Reagan. She would say, history has, a short attention span. Think about it. If it's short then, think about how short it is now. But history will only remember you in one sentence. What will your sentence be? And she would challenge them to figure out the sentence. And then she would illustrate. She would say, Lincoln, he freed the slaves. Franklin Roosevelt, he got us through the Depression and World War II. So what's your sense? If it's a cursory view of your presidency, what will be your sense? And that's an interesting notion, right? We will all have our sense, right? You are all in the beginning of creating your sense. But I looked at the people, the presidents that I've known, and I realized that whatever sentence we might construct with them, underlying that is a character trait that imbues the legacy of that president. So I looked at the presidents that I have known and that I've learned from as a leader. And I thought about what character trait most explains their legacy. And I've started with Gerald Ford, who I happened to get to know. This guy who I saw in a limousine when I was a kid is the first president I really got to know. And for him, it was doing what's right. He was an accidental president, the only president who's never been elected on a national ballot. He was elected through the provisions of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which said that we could nominate a vice president if there were a vacancy. Spiro Agnew, who was Richard Nixon's vice president, had resigned amidst a bribery scandal that had resurfaced from his days as governor of Maryland. And Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader in Congress, stepped into the vice presidency and then into the presidency upon the resignation of who? Richard Nixon. Right. And what did he do? What is his most famous thing? Relates to Nixon.
Watergate.
The pardon of Richard Nixon, which he believed he had to do in order to heal the nation from Watergate. Extraordinarily controversial at the time. 2/3 of Americans believe it was the wrong thing to do. And when he died, 1/3 of the American electorate believed it was the wrong. We had reversed our view of the importance of that decision, which was politically expensive for Gerald Ford and probably cost him the presidency in his own right when he ran in '76. That's him. Jimmy Carter, doing good. This is somebody who was, I think, inspired by the Christian ethos. He taught Sunday school. He was a very committed Baptist and wanted to do good in the world and tried to use the presidency to that end. He struck a peace between Israel and Egypt, which continues today against all odds at a harrowing 13 days at Camp David. And he would go on in his post-presidency to do things that were good for America and for the world. This failed president, by the estimation of many, was unable to get reelected in 1980 when he ran against Ronald Reagan, would find himself the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize 22 years after leaving office, as he remained committed to doing good. For Ronald Reagan, it's optimism.
You visited Carter at his kitchen.
I did. I'll tell you a quick story. So you all know Jimmy Carter, right? Died as a centurion earlier this year. And it's just a remarkable guy. I knew Jimmy Carter really well. But I'd gone to do a story on him for Parade magazine, which was at the time a huge magazine, about 56 million subscribers. And my wife and I had gone to church with him. He taught Sunday school at a church that wasn't a whole lot bigger than this room. So you could go see the former president of the 39th president of the United States teaching Sunday school in Plains, Georgia, population 640, in a really tiny church. And there's Jimmy Carter right there, teaching you about the Old Testament. It's a remarkable thing. So I went there, we sat with the Carters at church, and then they invited my wife and me to their house afterward. And we got to talking so long that my wife and I realized we were about to miss our plane in Atlanta. So we had to hop to it and get in the car. And Mrs. Carter said, well, we didn't have lunch. Hold on, just give me 5 minutes. And she goes and she packs up a lunch. And she gets out this recycled paper bag that it should have been retired years ago. And, puts these carrots in a plastic bag and packs us onion sandwiches. And we rush out to our car and President Carter says, hold on, we didn't get a picture. So we go back in their driveway. I put down the lunch, snap by a Secret Service agent, and and we got on our way. But that was the Carters, doing good, big things and small things. They always had other people on their minds, real people. I mentioned Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford, this goes back to legacy, something you all will think about in your careers, how you want to be remembered, right? What you want to do in the world. And he and I got one of his last interviews just shortly before he died. And he was hard of hearing. We were in this cavernous office, which too was about the size of this room. And he wanted me to sit behind the desk with him because he couldn't hear. So we sat about as close as Elizabeth and I were sitting. In fact, we were so close, our legs were touching. And I asked him how he wanted to be remembered. And he said, Mark, I was a healer and a builder. And if I am to be remembered that way, I would be most grateful. And when we remembered him, and I was one of them, I was on TV for his funeral, he was remembered just as that, a healer and a builder. As expensive as that pardon of Richard Nixon was, it helped us to heal from the wounds of Watergate and move on as a nation. So Gerald Ford got his wish, despite the fact that pardon was so expensive at the time. Reagan is optimism.
Sorry, were they the two who said, I want to do your eulogy or vice versa? Who was that?
Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
They were.
whoever died first.
You think about, do you all know, when you think of presidential friendships, is there anything that comes to mind?
Biden and Obama.
Biden, Obama, good. What else?
Bush and Michelle.
Bush and- That's a good one. But there was also George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton famously had a very close relationship, which speaks volumes about them because George H.W. Bush had been defeated for a second term by Ronald Reagan. Sorry, by Bill Clinton, excuse me. Well, it's the same with Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter denied Gerald Ford the presidency in his own right, and yet they became the closest of friends, as Jimmy Carter said to me, almost like brothers. And they promised to eulogize the other if they were the last one standing. And Jimmy Carter indeed eulogized Gerald Ford at the Gerald Ford Museum in Grand Rapids upon his death. Ronald Reagan, optimism. I loved your unbridled optimism today. When Ronald Reagan took the presidency in 1981, we were in a pretty dark place. We had gone through the very turbulent, very tempestuous 1960s, a lot of political violence, which we're again seeing today. We saw the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. We had the Vietnam War. Then you had Watergate. Then you had the economy crippled by stagflation. All these things were weighing America down. Ronald Reagan came in and said, America's best days are ahead of us. Optimism in itself is a very powerful tool. When you speak the way you guys spoke earlier today, people start believing again. You have to find something to hope for. And I think one of the things that Ronald Reagan had, he was an actor, and he acted the part of the president. He acted hopeful, right? He exuded this sanguine attitude that we began subscribing to as Americans that helped us to take us out of a dark place. Do I agree with all the policies of Ronald Reagan? No, I don't. But I do believe in his belief in America. And part of that was rooted in humor. He would use jokes all the time. He said, if you don't think we already have prayer in schools, then you haven't taken an exam, things like that. Little things, little barbs that he used to joke about himself. He was not very good at details. And he used to tell a joke about himself, about the reporter that comes to see him and says, Mr. President, tell me about your your budget. Reagan says, well, let's say you have a blueberry pie. Well, half of that pie, well, that's defense. And half of that pie, well, that's entitlements. And half of that pie, and the guy says, no, Mr. President, there are only two halves and a whole. He thinks for a second, he says, let's say you have 6 blueberry muffins. So self-deprecating humor. I mean, humor is often the elixir of an optimist, right? It shows you're upbeat. So Reagan is optimism. George H.W. Bush is humility. And I think example that I cite in the book, and this is a really important thing, is when the Berlin Wall is torn down, which marks a harbinger in the end of the Cold War. It signifies that America is winning the Cold War. Reporters go to the Oval Office and they ask they ask the president, how do you feel? He says, well, please. And they ask, why are you not jubilant? He says, well, no, I'm pleased. And the reason he wasn't more jubilant is he didn't want to compromise the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in place, somebody we could trust, not a hardliner, and in whom we could expect that there might be a peaceful end to the Cold War. And that's exactly what happened. He didn't beat his chest. George H.W. Bush did not beat his chest. He did not spike the football. He did not drop the mic. He did not proclaim this a triumph of American ideals over totalitarianism. He was humble in that moment. And that made a difference, a huge difference. I'm looking at the clock and seeing that it's close to half past. I don't want to go on.
You can run through the other two.
There are several more. So Bill Clinton resilience, personal, political scandal and challenges, and yet he continued to forge ahead. It was the longest sustained period of economic prosperity in American history. The American people knew that, and they supported Bill Clinton despite his personal demons and foibles. For George W. Bush, it's giving back. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was rolled out to the most desperate African and Caribbean nations where they were seeing huge swaths of their population threatened by the AIDS epidemic, was a lifesaver for so many. It's been in place since 2003, and 28 million citizens of the world have been saved by that program. A remarkable testament to George W. Bush's realization that America, in all its prosperity and all its goodness, could give back to the world. And then Barack Obama, grace as the first African-American president. We saw unfettered, virulent racism in the face of his presidency, and he handled it with the grace, with grace. So did Michelle Obama, for that matter, understanding that despite that hatred, despite that bigotry, but despite that vitriol, he was the president of all Americans and had a responsibility to behave as such.
Oh, that's fabulous. You ran right through that. Well, plus he could sing Amazing Grace. That was very beautiful, beautiful moment. Michelle, by the way, I used to work for him then, and Michelle and Valerie Jarrett said on the plane, he said, I'm thinking of singing at the end of this eulogy in South Carolina. And they said, oh, no, you can't sing. You don't know how to sing. You cannot sing. No. And you remember in the moment he paused and he thought, I'm going to do this thing. Yeah. And it was magic. If you've not seen it, it's worth looking. Okay, quick question for me. This is your lightning round. One question. You're about to do an ABC News interview. I'm always amazed at your facility on those interviews. Do you get those questions in advance? Like, do you have any idea what they're about to ask you?
No. By the way, me telling Elizabeth about Barack Obama is like, telling Noah about the flood. She was there, and if you haven't tapped into Elizabeth's knowledge of how government works based on her experience in the Obama White House for 3.5 years, you should. She can not only give you insight into what that experience looks like working at the White House at a very high level. She can also tell you about Barack and Michelle Obama from up close. You should have her for that. No, I don't get those questions. You got to think on your feet, and sometimes you screw up. I say some stupid things sometimes. I hope you won't notice, and most people don't. They notice if a hair is out of place. You have to worry about that stuff because it's a visual. Me think, can I get a consistent? But no, I don't get them.
Been there for years. You must have done something right. Okay, so now we're turning to you all and to who's online. Can I? Okay, great. Can I call on people? Wonderful. Let's start with you in the front row.
Hello, I'm Reed. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Reed.
And I was wondering if you could tell us what journalistic integrity is to you, especially because you mentioned that we're kind of in a tumultuous time where people are lacking trust in our institutions. Like, maybe you could speak to how you maintain that amongst the pressures of.
Yeah. So how do you maintain journalistic integrity in this environment? Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. Look, guys, I think that we should learn civics in school. I also think it's particularly important at this moment in time to learn media literacy. Where do you all get your, be truthful, where do you all get your news?
Twitter.
New York Times, Twitter, what else? Instagram, I'm hearing a lot of social media. The young people, I think 85% of young, I might be making stuff, which would dispel the notion that I have journalistic failure. I'm gonna make up a statistic. 85% of young people get their news from social media. What's the problem with that? Lies. Not true.
Every different media has a different bias. Like in high school, we talked about how like you need like for example, AP News tries to be like the least biased, for example.
I love AP News. You're so right. You were the optimist before. You, I love you. You're fabulous. What else? Any other thoughts on this? Be careful where you get. Let me just. Oh, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Social media can be an echo chamber.
Be an echo chamber. So why is it an echo chamber? This is really important to know. Why? What do media? I don't want to lead you here, but do social media outlets want?
Fiction.
Attention. Why do they want attention? Why do media platforms, this might be a stupid question, but why do media platforms want you on their platform? Right, so the more time you spend on that platform, what happens? The more what? The more money they're making. So what do? They have these algorithms. Your name is? Shamari. Shamari might be, this is misinformation. But Shamari is a right-wing activist, right? And if it knows that this is misinformation, disinformation, I'm saying that right now. But if they know that Shamari is right-leaning, they're gonna serve up more and more extreme content to bring Shamari down a rabbit hole of stuff, to continue to engage her, and it might radicalize, right? So that's what's happened. If your name is Ajane. If Ajane is left-leaning, it's just gonna do the same thing for her. Be careful of this stuff, guys, and they're gonna serve up stuff that looks legitimate. Find media sources like the Associated Press that you trust, right? And gravitate toward those media sources, and also try not to do it online. Try not to give TikTok and X and Snapchat and Instagram your money. Give it to the New York Times so they can support a journalistic operation, if you feel they are, with integrity, right? Support journalism, support local journalism. That's particularly important too. Local journalism is democracy's immune system. It is. It keeps people accountable. It holds people accountable. So there are news deserts that are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. If we're going to unify, if we're going to come together as a country, we have to eliminate these sources of misinformation and disinformation, which have us believing things that simply are not true. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
Great, how about right back in the middle here? Yes.
Okay, awesome. Hello, my name is Chloe, and I just want to say this was so refreshing for me because I love politics and engaging and talking about government. So I really love this, super riveting. I have a bit of a three-parter, so just like my thoughts rolling around. But I was curious to think of are there any comparable presidents that have been able to push as much progressive acts and as plentiful as LBJ, in your opinion? And with that, I'm also thinking, is there a necessity to acknowledge the heavy lift to reverse the damage that has been inflicted on this country? And is that also a matter of maintaining the integrity and stability of Congress?
Great. Chloe, let me just,
You want to repeat a bit?
well, here's what I'm gonna give you guys a suggestion, Chloe, if I may. I'm gonna do this very respectfully. They're great questions. Let me just say, as a guy who asks questions for a living to powerful people, when you're thinking about questions, and those are really good ones, ask one at a time. Because when you don't, I'm gonna ask that last question first, because that's the only one I'm gonna remember. And that might be your worst question. That might be the least important question you have. Just know that if you've asked a good question and you have a follow-up question, you can ask a follow-up question. And I'll answer that one too.
Is he afraid still on the stage?
Yes.
Because you asked a really good question.
If you're polite. That's okay.
That's all right, but just remember that when you're thinking about these things, if you want your question answered, ask one at a time and then move on. So of those three questions, Chloe, which do you want to?
Ooh, is there a necessity to acknowledge the heavy lift to reverse the damage being done? And is that a matter of maintaining the stability and integrity of Congress?
Yeah, I think look, you can't have in my opinion, the reckless dismantling of government we saw with Doge and continue to see without some major downstream effects. How can there not be downstream effects? Right, so we have yet to see the consequences of what has transpired in these very eventful 8 or 9 months. We're gonna see that in time, and some we may not see for a generation or more. As for instance, cutting off research that happens in great universities like the University of Pennsylvania is gonna have an adverse downstream effect. And I think we have to try to get ahead of this as much as we can and anticipate what the damage is going to be and try to figure out how you bolster our government. That's gonna fall to you guys, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But let me give you a minor example. Who follows the weather app on Apple, the Apple weather app?
Yes.
How is it now relative to 6 months ago? Any observations? Much worse. Why? Because NOAA has been dismantled, right? This government-funded agency that used to evaluate very accurately as we see our weather pattern. And that not only, can affect whether you pack an umbrella in the morning or not. That can affect whether you know that there's a hurricane coming or a tornado, right? These are really important things. That's one example, but there are going to be so many more examples to come. I'm going to go back to LBJ for a second, who really did understand political power. And he said something that I want you to all remember. Any jackass can kick down a barn door, but it takes a damn fine carpenter to build one. Anybody can destroy something. That's the easiest thing in the world. Think about how easy it is to burn down a building. It just takes the striking of a match and putting that match in the right place. Think about what is required to build that building. You are the builders. You are the doers. By being here in this program, you've raised your hand to say that you want to be a part of that. You're going to be more vitally important. I'm saying this with abundant confidence. You're going to be more vitally important than any generation has been in the history of our country because of the barn door that's been kicked down. But also think about how rewarding it is to build something. When you die, when you think back on your life, hopefully many, many years from now, you're not going to be thinking about the things you destroyed. You're going to be thinking about the things that you built. You built a career. You built a family. You built a marriage, right? You build a resume. That requires great work. But if you're fueled by purpose, as you are, by virtue of the fact that you want to be in this program, that you want to be public service, that you want to give back, I can tell you, you're going to have a very rewarding life. And you're going to take great pride and great satisfaction in rebuilding what we've lost. Now, do you have another question you want to ask, or should we move on? Do you want to?
It's okay.
Chloe, thank you. Good questions. And I hope I know that was constructive criticism. Great question.
Okay, we're gonna take one more from the floor and then we're gonna go online. How about the very back row on the left? Oh, that side, yeah.
I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Danny. I'm 23, and I've said it to some of my friends in the court, but I do have congressional aspirations myself. And when you said that you worked at the LBJ Center, that resonated with me because he grew up in poverty, such as myself, and he climbed up the political ladder, which is what I want to do. But my main question to you is, out of those 7 presidents that you've interviewed, which interview has been your favorite?
Yeah, out of the 7 presidents that I've interviewed, Danny, thank you for the question. Out of the 7 presidents I've interviewed, what has been the most meaningful? I've interviewed some of them multiple times. I've interviewed George W. Bush probably 20 times, and George H.W. Bush 6 and Carter 6, and Obama, Ford twice, Obama once, Bill Clinton twice. So not, some more than, I don't, I had the great privilege of doing a book called The Last Republicans about the relationship between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And I think that book, is important to history because it's only the second time that we've had, and maybe the last time, we'll have a father-son presidency. And there was only 8 years difference between those two administrations, and they had never told that story before. They're famously, not introspective. And I hope you will think about your reputations as you embark on your career. Talk about that too, but they trusted me, and I really appreciate the fact that they trusted me to tell that story. So the interviews I think that I had with George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush about their lives, about their presidencies, and about their relationships, those were meaningful to me because they were never on the record. Thank you for the question, Danny. Can I just say, I've got to sprint out of here at 5 up for the steak, but do me a favor, I've got a hit on ABC News Live at 5 after. But if you want to stick around, I'd be happy to come back in. I would love to talk to you. I don't know, I'm just going to be down the hall. So forgive me for running out of here, but please stick around if you want to talk after the top of the session.
Beautiful. Okay, let's do one from Mindy online.
Thanks so much. I'm going to do a little bit of combining to try to get to as many as we can. So a couple questions about what can we do as future public servants or current public servants to increase trust and faith in government and get towards civic dialogue given all of the current circumstances. And these are coming from Hannah, who's a prospective MPA student, and Yvette Nunez, who's a Fels graduate from 2022.
Great questions. How do you restore trust? I think the one thing that we need to do, guys, is I've said it before, is we've got to put these things away. I mean, seriously, this does not help to repair the divide in our country. The fact that you can put something out there that is divisive and do so with absolute impunity. I can't because I'm not somewhat known and have a contract with ABC and I have to be responsible. So I can't do that. But most people can, right? And it doesn't help. It just doesn't help. That enragement doesn't help. It causes us to further vilify and demonize, and in some cases dehumanize people we might disagree with. Bill Clinton said something really interesting. I'm going to do a really bad imitation of Bill Clinton. But he said, someone was talking about and by the way, you're Americans, so please know this isn't a judgment. You can have any view you want. We're still Americans, and that, Lyndon Johnson said that the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom. That's what makes us American. The fact that you can hold one view and I can hold another. But he was happened to be talking about MAGA Republicans, and he said, you may not like the Trump sign in your neighbor's lawn or the MAGA hat on his head, but if your house is on fire, he might be the first one to your doorstep with a bucket.
Good imitation.
Yeah. And you know what? That's a really good observation. You can think that because they supported Trump, or somebody say because you supported Biden, you think a certain way, but honestly, they might be really good people who just happen to believe differently. So to answer the question, Mindy, I think is we've got to put these things away and start trying to listen to one another.
What's Decro? Remember? What's Decro? A little related about taking them out.
I haven't read this, but go ahead, please.
Oh, well, Steve just had a New York, he just told us, he had a New York Times piece last week, I think, saying that he's made everybody leave their devices home in his classes. And he's found immediately how much more focused people are and how they really are engaged. And when they write things down with a pen, it really stays with them much more for some reason than if they type. And he's going to try and speak with Governor Shapiro, he just told us a minute ago, and get this hopefully put in the school system. Anyway.
I mean, it doesn't mean you, again, I happen to be a Democrat. I'm a proud Democrat. My parents, I grew up in Philadelphia, were staunch Republicans. They're no longer living, but, you know, my father would have voted for Trump. My mom would have voted for Trump. But, you know, and if it snowed and the elderly woman next door, was unable to do her driving, my father would be the one shoveling her driving. He's a good man. He just happened to believe in things fundamentally different politically than I did. So we can't demonize the other side and assume that they believe something that we think that they believe. You have to listen to them talk.
Okay, how about we do one more in the room? All right, let's do one more in the back row. But yeah, that's you. Good.
Hi, Edward Warwick. Over your long, Edward, yeah.
Edward.
Over your long career asking questions, I'm sure at some point you didn't get to ask the question that you really wanted to. My question to you is, how do you cope with missed opportunities and learn from them?
You know, the key when you're doing, you guys will probably all moderate conversations at some point. This is something I'm sort of passionate about. You don't worry about the question you didn't ask. Worry about the flow of the conversation. And look, you don't have to be an expert on every topic. You don't. You have to have a cursory knowledge that you build on for a conversation. And know that it's not about you, it's about the person you're talking to and getting the most out of that person, right? So know that yes, you might be on stage, but if you're asking the questions, your job is just to get, my job might be if I were moderating a conversation with Elizabeth, get the most from her for your audience. So think about the flow of the conversation. I don't think about the questions I didn't ask. It's foolish to do that because the opportunity is no longer there. What I think about is, did I get the stuff from them that made for an easy flowing conversation that where people could take things that were of interest, that were poignant or entertaining or interesting or illuminating somehow. That's the best that you can do.
Just a quick footnote, plus when I worked for President Obama, he said, you know, this is Washington, it's terrible. People don't answer the question. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the etiquette in Washington is if you're asked a question, you answer your own question. They'll ask it again and you answer your own question. And they'll ask it a third time and you answer your own question and they won't ask it a fourth. That's the etiquette. So it's, you know, if you're receiving a question, it might frustrate the hell out of the questioner because they ain't answering it. Okay, Mindy, one more from online.
Great. I'll do another couple of combinations. A few questions tapping into your historian perspective. There's been, you know, recent waves of political violence and some anti-democratic movements. There have also been in the past, and you talked a bit about that in the 60s and 70s, and even looking back to World War II, other things. What trends do you see? What are critical things that help overcome those challenges? And these are from Ed Ford, who is a Fels grad from 2005, and Michael Fratangelo, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, who's a community member and a big fan, he said.
Thanks, Ed, Michael, for the question. I'd say, look, you see vicissitudes, you see ups and downs in American history. I think the last period where we saw political violence, I mentioned, is the 1960s. You know, we saw these assassinations of very prominent people, including the President of the United States, who was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm X in 64, Martin Luther King, followed by Bobby Kennedy in a 2-month period in 1968. 1968 was called the nightmare year by Lyndon Johnson, who was the sitting president at the time. And there were a lot of people who didn't know if we could recover from that. There were other things that were happening then. The Vietnam War, we saw the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War. There was a naval ship, U.S. naval ship that was seized by the North Koreans for 11 months. All these things were happening in the country and in the world. And a lot of people wondered whether we would survive. We did. We got stronger. We usually do when there are great periods of division and uncertainty and upheaval, because we have a strong system of government in place and a resilient people. We have to make sure that that government stays in place first and foremost. We have to make sure that while government is being eradicated, our democracy is not. That's where you guys come in. We are not the United States of America without being a democratic republic. We're not. And we have to ensure that that system of government is not dismantled. Because if it is, I don't know what we have anymore. We're not the country we profess to be. And then I can't have any assurance that we will survive this moment. That's key. I think the other thing, and I would say this respectfully, is we need leadership from our leaders, in particular, our president. As you saw from Lyndon Johnson in the wake of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, he called for unity. He condemned violence writ large, not just from the left or the right, but the political violence that was tearing us apart as a nation. And he called for Americans to come together. That's what we need from our president.
Okay, last question is from me, and you sort of anticipated it, which is, can you tell this group of mostly 25-year-olds a couple of things you wish you could have told your 25-year-old self?
Listen to this one, guys. This is an important one. Again, you don't have to have it all figured out now. Life is long, I hope, for all of you. And you're going to see these changes in your career, in your personal life that you never anticipated. You just have to trust yourself. Trust what you learned here. Trust what you learn along the way, and try to do the best you can. I was not a presidential historian until I was in my mid-40s. I had a completely different career. It was on the business side of publishing. So when I was the publisher of Newsweek, it was principally a business function, right? Totally different. I was at MTV for a while. My career slid into the doldrums. I didn't know if I would ever get out of this abyss in my career, but I worked hard and I believed in myself. And I hope you're doing the same thing. Other thing I would mention is reputation, and Elizabeth can tell you this too. Reputation is everything, right? Do you know pointillism? This is an art question, so you're not expected to know. What is pointillism in art?
Coloring something in or giving something dimension by
Small points. So all these small points create a bigger image, right? But in and of itself, that point might not mean anything, right? But assembled together, they mean something. You're young. Most of the canvas is blank, but you're starting to populate that canvas with dots that is creating an impression. Over time, that impression will get stronger and bigger. People will begin to see, maybe Elizabeth sees it one way and I see it another way, but generally speaking, if you look at a pointless painting, we're seeing a boat, or we're seeing a river, or we're seeing a guy in a hat, right? Basically, it might seem slightly differently, but that's what you're seeing. Think of your career and your reputation now. Think of the point you're putting on that canvas every day and the impression that you're creating. Be good to people, be kind to people, keep your word. Do the basic things that your parents taught you. That'll become really important as you're trying to ascend the ranks in your career. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you're doing. And keep on with that optimism. Keep your chins up. It's going to be okay.
Thank you.